Chapter 2. They started the next day. First thing they needed, Pa said, was a lean-to for shelter. So they got their cabin built. He took his axe and cut down some thin saplings. He found two with forked branches and stuck the ends into the ground, laying a crosspiece between. Along this crosspiece, Daniel and Will piled more saplings, sloping down to the ground. Then they stacked up brush on the sides and more on top. By mid-morning, they had a three-sided shelter to keep off the rain. It was barely big enough for the three of them, and Pa couldn't quite sit upright, but he said it would do. Pa rolled a fair-sized log across the front. He gathered together some dry leaves and twigs, struck a spark with his flint on a bit of charred cloth, and blew on it until it smoked and finally burst into a tiny red flame. "We'll keep a fire going day and night," he told them. "That will scare off any wood varmints." Though they scarcely needed it for warmth these late summer days, Daniel was glad for the fire between them and whatever creatures might be out there among the trees. He and Will emptied out the packs old Ben had carried and lined up their supplies at the front of the lean-to. The large sack of cornmeal, the small one of salt, a few potatoes, a near empty jug of molasses, the big iron pot, and the smaller frying pan. Her spider, Ma called it, on account of it sitting up on three legs in the fire. If Ma was here, Daniel thought, she'd have this rough lean-to cozied up so it felt like home in no time at all. But Ma was back in Pennsylvania, waiting for the cabin to be finished before she and the four little ones joined them. His little sister Sarah just turned 6, and Abby 5. They did everything together. Zeke, only 3, but trying to do whatever Daniel and Will did, falling down and scrambling right up again. And the new baby born in the early summer. Josiah, he was called, after Pa's oldest brother. Could be Pa was thinking of them too. He stopped only to eat some cold Johnny cake before picking up his axe. "I have in mind a likely spot for our cabin," he told Daniel and Will. Once more, the two boys followed him through the trees, elm, oak, and sugar maple. Daniel saw beech, walnut, hickory, and here and there a slender dogwood. Those were only some of the trees in this unending forest. Others Daniel hadn't come across before and didn't know their names. Pa took them to a small rise not far from the creek. "Here," he said. It was a likely spot, Daniel thought. Ma would be happy not to have to walk far to fetch water for cooking and washing, yet it was high enough to stay dry when spring rains came. Not only that, but Pa pointed out a spring of pure drinking water flowing out of a little mossy place nearby. Daniel cupped some into his hand and drank. It was icy cold and smelled of some sweet herb. Ma would know which one. She would gather it and all the other herbs in these woods for tonics and cures when she came. Without another word, Pa began swinging his axe at the trees. He picked out a good-sized oak and cut a notch in its side. Daniel knew this was the side where he wanted it to fall. Then Pa sat back on his heels and let his axe fly. He swung from his feet, all his strength flowing up and out through the head of the axe. Pa was not a tall man, nor did he look real powerful, but when he swung his axe, Daniel was amazed. Suddenly he had the grace and power of a giant. Time after time, the axe head bit into the dark tree trunk, cutting a deep, bright-colored wound, until at last Daniel heard the oak creak. "Stay clear, boys," Pa shouted. The tree leaned, it swayed, it seemed to shudder, then very slowly it toppled and fell with a muffled crash. "Hurrah!" cheered Will. The oak lay on the ground, massive and still, with broken limbs sprawled out in all directions, some leaning against the trees next to it, others reaching down nearly to the creek. Yet, looking up, Daniel saw no difference in the wall of trees around them. He and Will set to work, rolling away and hauling off as much of the stripped off branches and brush as they could. Pa did not stop to rest, but went on to the next tree, a tall, straight elm. Once more his axe swung strong and true, carving a deeper and deeper slice into the tree's side. Stand clear, Pa's voice rang out again. Daniel heard that terrible creaking sound, and the elm too came crashing down. By late afternoon, a tumble of fallen trees covered the ground, but still Daniel could not make out any hole in the dark green ceiling overhead. They had not made a clearing. Not yet. Pa would not quit, though. He never would quit. He would attack those trees again tomorrow. Daniel knew. Back at the lean-to, Daniel was glad to sit down, but Pa still would not rest. He picked up his musket and said, I'll see what I can find us for supper. Will's face brightened. Can I come too? He asked. He loved to hunt. At home, he was in the woods as much as Ma would let him, shooting birds and squirrels and rabbits. Pa shook his head. You boys build up that fire. Have that kettle ready to boil when I get back. Will's face fell. He didn't say any more. If Daniel told him to do something, he'd be sure to argue. But you didn't argue with Pa. When he made up his mind to something, his face turned hard. It was no use trying to sway him. In just a few steps, Pa was gone, swallowed up by the shadowy trees. Their towering trunks seemed to press closer around the lean-to as daylight faded and quiet settled over the woods again. And once more, Daniel felt a sharp little prickle inside his chest. What if something should happen to Pa? What if he didn't come back? What would they do? Will didn't seem to have these kind of thoughts. Already he was busy poking at the fire with a long stick. As the coals began to glow, Will fed them with bits of dry twigs. Soon little flames were licking upward. A good fire was what they needed, Daniel thought. Fire would keep away the wood varmints, keep the three of them safe. He hurried to gather fallen branches to feed the flames. And even after the fire was burning bright and steady, he kept piling more dead wood next to the lean-to. By the time Pa returned, water was beginning to bubble in the iron pot. He dropped a small bundle on the ground. Rabbit, he said with a rare smile. Daniel skinned it, cutting the meat into chunks with his knife and dropping it into the pot. Soon the lean-to was filled with the good smell of rabbit stew. It made him think again of Ma. Of course, her rabbit stew would be full of other savory things, wild mushrooms, onions, carrots, a pinch of this or that herb from her garden. Still, this plain stew smelled mighty fine. When they finished eating it, mopping out the pot with the last scraps of joint cake, the three of them stretched out to sleep. There was just room enough in the lean-to for them to lie side by side, if no one rolled over. Pa's feet about reached the fire. Right, boys, he said. In a minute, he was breathing deeply. Daniel felt snug lying between Pa and Will in the tight little shelter that they had built. His stomach was full of rabbit stew. The fire still flickered brightly between him and the dark, towering trees. He was about to doze off when he heard the sound. Ow! It was eerie, a slowly rising cry that went on, then hung in the air like something not of this world. Now it came again from a different part of the forest, long, drawn out, and mournful. It sent a shiver creeping up his spine. Daniel clutched at Pa's arm till he came awake with a start. What is it? Pa sat up on his elbows, reaching for his gun. Then he lay back down. Wolves, he said. So it was true, there were wolves in this forest. Inside his head, Daniel could see them, lifting their sharp noses to howl at the night sky. Gray, ghost-like shapes circling closer and closer through the trees. It's all right, Pa told him, his voice softer. They won't attack us. They only go after the weak and the wounded, and we have our fire. Daniel stared into the fire's red glow. That fire was a comfort, no doubt about it. It warmed him inside and outside. In a moment, Pa went off to sleep again, and finally Daniel did too. But in his dreams, gray, ghost-like shapes floated among the trees. their earthy cries echoing in the night.